and there are absolutely no alert measures that are necessary at this time or contemplated. Now, if you have some questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Crisis management, is that put into effect when this arrives?
Crisis management is in effect.
Who is making the decisions for the government right now? Who's making the decisions?
Constitutionally, gentlemen, you have the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State in that order. And should the President decide he wants to transfer the helm to the Vice President, he will do so.
Who makes that decision?
As of now, I am in control here in the White House, pending return of the Vice President, and in close touch with him. If something came up, I would check with him, of course.
I welcome this kind of examination.
You are free to do as we tell you. You are free to do as we tell you.
His head could be seen to move violently forward.
Back and to the left. Back and to the left.
That's why I don't read the newspaper. I'm a man. I'm 40.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency.
As of now, I am in control here in the White House.
This is crack cocaine from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or PCP. It's as innocent looking as candy.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.
Anybody who's not willing to change based on what they learned is ignorant.
Coffee's for closers only.
I think we're giving you enough.
Go on to Chicago and let's win there.
Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is Ray Locker of USA Today. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing and traversing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 111, Mae Brussell on Alexander Haig and the Reagan Assassination attempt. Now, this is the 9th episode of the Midnight Rider News Legends series, which we started as a way to sort of play some older clips and some older speeches and some presentations from those who've really come before us and have done a good job or even a questionable job in certain places. But tonight, we're going to return to one of my favorites, the great Mae Brussell. Now, we're going to play a series of clips from Mae tonight, all dealing with Alexander Haig and the Reagan assassination, and you'll hear quite a bit about George H.W. Bush as well, I'm sure. But to set the stage a little bit first, the Reagan assassination attempt occurred on March 30th, 1981, 2 months after he'd taken office and approximately 6.5 years or so after the resignation of Richard Nixon. Now, Haig was Nixon's final chief of staff. He'd taken over for H.R. Haldeman on May 4th, 1973, and he was just beginning his stint as Reagan's Secretary of State. For those of you who've heard our Watergate episodes, you know that Lynn Kolodny and Ray Locker particularly both believe that Haig orchestrated a silent coup to remove Nixon from the White House. Now, it was a coup that stems from a military spy ring, which Lynn and Robert Getland document so well in their book Silent Coup, The Removal of a President. So if you want more information on that, if you want to know more about the book, you can also go to Watergate.com, which is the home of the Kolodny collection. It's a valuable site. We recommend it highly. Now, Ray Locker touched on this in his work, Nixon's Gamble, but in May, he'll release a book with a title that's even more direct. It's going to be called Haig's Coup. It's my most anticipated book of 2019, so as you can tell, I'm obviously excited about that. But tonight, the floor will be given to Mae Brussell, and I've always said that Mae's research skills and her prescient analysis are really what sets her apart from most other analysts. She is amazing, and what we're going to play first will show you just how amazing she was. Now, this is from her 486th episode, which was either recorded on March 28th or March 29th of 1981. And I say that because the website says it's the 29th, but her collection lists the episode as the 28th. Either way, this is 1 or 2 days before the Reagan assassination attempt when she records this. But Mae already has both Haig and Bush in her crosshairs.
Now, there's a lot in the news about the backfighting and the stabbing going on, the anger of Alexander Haig, and I've avoided talking about him for a few weeks, but I guess I have to mention him at this time, as repulsive as it is. Alexander Haig is mad. He wants to be head of the emergency contingency unit. He wants to control foreign policy, and he also wanted to have total control of domestic policy. Alexander Haig could create a Reichstag type of operation and take control of the White House. He had it when Richard Nixon was slipping out of office, and he worked closely with Alexander Butterfield, the man who taped Richard Nixon, to make sure that Nixon got out of office, and Haig and Butterfield had been closely associated in the Pentagon together from the time that John Kennedy was murdered. They had been associates. Incidentally, Alexander Haig had called in his friend Butterfield into the White House in 1969 when Richard Nixon was president, January 69, and Butterfield was living in Australia. That's the time when the Nugan Bank was full steam. It got a lot of money in 73 for counterintelligence operations, but also it was being set up in 1969 and the late 60s, and that's when Alexander Butterfield was stationed in Australia. And as soon as Nixon was in office, he was called back and went into the White House. He was, as I say, in the Pentagon with Haig and Butterfield were together at the time, right after John Kennedy was murdered from 1964. Then they went on to take other jobs. Butterfield went to the War College and then down to Australia, and Haig worked his way up. And I'll do a little bit more on that in a minute. Well, Haig would like to take over the White House and the domestic affairs, but there were a couple of incidences last week that I think stepped in his way. I think he's moving too fast, too far. There's too many of them taking position, but he really, I think because of what he knows, went on all these years through the White House and being there at the height of Watergate as well as every other crucial period through the 60s and 70s, he just assumed that he could walk over all the new people that are in Washington right now who haven't been there that long, the new team that Ronald Reagan has appointed. And there were several things that happened before the quick announcement that Vice President Bush would take over the domestic emergency team that is being formed. The first story last week was one that Bush had been shot. The person was apprehended and arrested. It was taken right out of the news, and we haven't read much of that. We know Bush wasn't killed, but the person that was arrested might have told something that he wasn't supposed to say. The second thing is the hushed-up affair in Florida last week of the 13 men camouflaged down in Crystal River, Florida. There hasn't been a thing in the news all week about that with their semi-automatic weapons, and they were a group that allegedly were recruited by Soldier of Fortune, which is a strictly CIA organization, operation, and publication. And they belong to a Vietnam Special Forces group. Again, the same assassination type team that were set up, funded through the Nugan Bank in Australia for taking over America or whatever they need to do domestically or overseas. This group was headed by somebody from Birmingham, Alabama, Franklin Joseph Camper, and they had guerrilla warfare manuals, automatic weapons, trained in the military and counterintelligence. They carried the usual kinds of weapons, Soviet weapons, Japanese, Israeli weapons, and were linked to the CIA and Army bases nearby. The FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms haven't been alerted to arrest them. They've passed it off that they simply trespassed a little too far near an atomic energy place. But I'm not sure that they were supposed to be near an installation and just went a little bit too far over and didn't know what they were doing. I don't believe that for a minute, and these people have not made much in the news in terms of biographies or what they were doing. As I said, they worked some in World War II and in the Green Berets in Vietnam. They could have been trained as mercenaries for United States terror or the type of Reichstag taking over a particular city or even a state or coming down with some kind of using atomic bombs to terrorize this country. It's that kind of an activity that would put Haig in office, even though the line of succession doesn't go immediately to Haig. He did managed to take over very nicely when Nixon was eased out. And besides the early rumor of Bush's death and also this group of people that were apprehended just by a fluke in Florida, there was a dinner in Washington, D.C. in honor of Haig that indicates the way Haig was moving just too fast. And if I were Ronald Reagan or George Bush, I would be a little bit scared of this power. This is really a conflict between the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA. Haig working with a long team of Nazis from World War II, people that want to control the Pentagon, the White House, versus Bush, who is more mild, went to Yale. I don't know what kind of, he has power. He was director of the CIA, ambassador to China, a wealthy oil man from Texas, but there's nothing gross or greedy. He doesn't seem to be desperate to grab the power, and Haig clawed his way all the way up to the top. Now, as soon as Ronald Reagan became president, or within 2 months after, there was a big dinner in Washington, D.C. for Haig, and it was reported in the Los Angeles Times. Capital dinner for Haig has the Jamesons hopping. Actress and business executive Eva Gabor Jameson, whose husband is very influential with all branches of military and defense, came in from the Bahamas, where they have a home, for a black-tie dinner at the Metropolitan Club for Secretary of State Alexander Haig. Senator Charles Percy, the Foreign Relations Committee, was there. Admiral Thomas B. Hayward, Chief of Naval Operations, British Ambassador Sir Nicholas Henderson, Prince and Princess Yoka Trubetsky, Washington developer C. Wyatt Dickerson, the Prince and Princess, Troubetz, is their name. Albert A. Grasselli, Vice President of International Division of Rockwell International. Frank Jameson, the host, was former affiliated with them. General Lyman Lemitzer, former Supreme Allied Commander for Europe and former Army Chief of Staff. Warren Adler, who publishes the Washington Dossier, and Mrs. Adler. Tunisia's Ali Heder, Hungary's Ferenc Esther Gallos, I'm not pronouncing that right. Jordan's Fazad El Sharaf, Ireland's Sean Donlan, Admiral George Anderson, former Chief of Naval Operations and former Ambassador to Portugal, where the Jamesons also have a home. Harry Combs, President of Gates Learjet. Donald Daly, President of San Diego's Daly Corporation. Thomas Powell, President of Martin Marietta Corporation. John Winkle, Vice President of Used Aircraft, Ben Schemmer, editor of the Armed Forces Journal, and so forth. There's a little dinner party for Haig, and I should think that with this kind of promotion of his social life and this power, you could get a coup d'etat. The one in Spain didn't work, where the king was kicked out, where the military were held at bay and the various forces didn't go along with them. In Chile, you did get a military junta overthrow the government that happened in South Korea. It does happen, and the United States has to face the possibility that you have a team there that are power hungry. Democracy doesn't last forever. If there's a national crisis or an emergency, and they will create the crisis and they will create the emergency, these people are all behind Alexander Haig. That's a lot of people, because even though Reagan has his kitchen cabinet of a few old cronies that have been with him a long time, they don't have the power of this who's who of the dinner party for Alexander Haig. Okay, I'm going now to talk about the power struggle that is taking place besides the domestic desire for Haig to own or control, I say own, both the foreign policy and the domestic policy in case of emergency service. You see, the Office of Emergency Service included James McCord at the time of Watergate. He belonged to a 16-man team in case of national or international emergencies, and he was never prosecuted or never went to jail at the time of Watergate. He represented the CIA, the FBI, the White House. They had their only walkie-talkies, radio communications, and they determine the crisis and tell the president if the crisis is necessary to take control, and they also take control if the president is away. And it was very important to Haig to have control of both the domestic and the foreign policies, and quickly, a week early and long before he expected the decision to be made, and he thought he'd be head of this team, they put George Bush in, and he was mad. Now, in addition to that, there is a terrible power struggle going on in Washington, D.C., because even though Haig has power, he's very obnoxious, and there are a lot of people there that can't deal with this gross way that he is handling himself and making statements such as the way the nuns were killed in El Salvador without any basis, or statements about terrorism in Europe that have been disputed, coming from the Soviet Union, that have been disputed even by the CIA. Well, in this White House feud, you have Alexander Haig, who worked with Robert Kennedy's administration, literally a spy within the Kennedy camp at the time of Bay of Pigs, and then worked for LBJ and the National Security Council when Kennedy was killed, and joined the assassination team of Rocky and Kissinger and moved his way up. He jumped over 240 other people in the military to get handpicked by Rockefeller to be in the position he's in today, and worked closely, as I say, with Butterfield when Nixon was pushed out, and this gave Haig, the Secretary of State, the position he wanted and has today. Haig has been behind the scenes long before the Bay of Pigs and the killing of Kennedy by the combination of the CIA, the Defense Department, the anti-Castro Cubans. Also under this roof, under Haig, is Walter Stessel. He was in the State Department in Germany. He was in Poland. He was in Brazil. He was in the Soviet Union when Lee and Marina Oswald were there. And he's the gentleman from the State Department who's talking loudly about the blockade against Cuba. Each one has their favorite shtick, and Stessel's taking the Cuba one, and Haig is going with the terrorism. The Russians are the greatest terrorists in the world. I might have mentioned on the program before, I used to live next door to Walter Stessel. He lived next door to my folks. The Stessels moved away. His mother's still friendly with my folks. He went to Beverly Hills High School, and I knew him when I was growing up. He's right under Haig right now at this time and knows what went on in terms of the Kennedy assassination because of Lee and Marina working for the government and the CIA and Navy intelligence while they were in the Soviet Union, and Marina coming back with Lee. Under them and along with them is Richard Pipes, who's been opening his mouth and giving speeches. The USSR must give up communism or go to war. They have to change their form of government or fight. Pipes is a student of Harvard out of the school of Priscilla Johnson, who went to Harvard, went to the Soviet Union, was in the CIA, greeting Lee Harvey Oswald over there. Pipes was associated with John Paisley. They both worked for George Bush under the Russian Division of Studying Russia and Strategies Against Russia, Team A and B. Paisley was murdered, and Pipes took over the main position, and he's our expert on Tsarist Soviet terrorism, that it's in the blood of Russians to be terrorists because the Tsars were terrorists and taught it to the Bolsheviks, and that's why they can't give up terrorism. And then under them is Richard Allen, or along with him from the National Security, Ronald Reagan's assistant there, who says that the Allies are too pacifist. His shtick is that it's better to be dead than red, and he's telling our allies, hey, you're too soft now. You'd rather be red than dead. And he's been scolding the Allies, and they're not sure they want nuclear weapons in Europe. So Richard Allen that's his speech. He gave that speech before the Young Americans for Freedom last week. Young Americans for Freedom was formed by William Buckley in the CIA with Douglas Caddy. Robert Morris of the early House investigation committees, the Internal Security, left Washington to go down to Texas in 1962 to help form Young Americans for Freedom, and that's when Volkmar Schmidt and Larry Schmidt and Bernard Weissman and a group from Germany, military intelligence, U.S. military working in Germany, came to the Dallas area for the Kennedy assassination. So he was speaking to this group of Young Americans for Freedom who got their start planning to take over the United States, and part of the plan included killing Kennedy. And William Casey of the OSS CIA days, he's the other part of this team. He was very much in the news at the time of Watergate. He was getting $10,000 a month from Robert Vesco as an attorney. He was involved with the Security Exchange scandals, the money that had gone out of there. Bernie Cornfield and Vesco connections were hushed up at the time that Casey was brought into the Reagan team, but any book on Watergate goes into these dogs very clearly. And so that every single person on this team knows what went on in the past and knows about each other's roles. Haig can wear the hat, Stessel can have the shoes, Pipes can have the coat, Allen can have the pants, and Casey can have the umbrella. And they're going to go round and round and shoot their mouth off while our allies are listening. And no matter what they say, there's no way that they could win a war with the Soviet Union now or even later, I don't believe. And yet they're determined to speak and scream about the Soviet Union being aggressive in Afghanistan or in Poland, and we're having problems that may bring us to World War III in Poland right now that were instigated and caused by these teams of Brzezinski and Kissinger and so forth. But no matter how we edge them on or nudge them on, I guarantee you the United States is not ready to go to war over the Polish situation, even if the troops went in tomorrow, and if we went to war, we couldn't win. So this team really needs psychiatrists. I think they're mentally sick. They're power greedy. They have been told nothing but reinforcement reports that have nothing to do with the world as it is today, and yet they shoot their mouth off, and our allies are sitting back. And I don't have time this evening to read a whole series of headlines from foreign press and domestic about our allies at this time. Now, I got a letter from one of my subscribers to these tapes who follows them very seriously and asked me to give a description of Fritz Cramer, Kraemer. He was the man who, in quotes, discovered Henry Kissinger. And I looked up some sources, and you can find his name in the index of libraries. He's the one man who discovered two Secretary of States, Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. So you know that Cramer has to be an important person. In one book that I have on Cramer and Kissinger, it's called Henry Kissinger, Private or Public Story, written by Ralph Blumenfeld of the New York Post. It's a very favorable book to Henry Kissinger because the people who did the interviewing all had links or covered the basis that Henry Kissinger was involved in satisfactorily. One of the authors was in Firth, Germany. The other interviewed people from U.S. Army counterintelligence, and the other from the Rockefeller staff. But even a book written by people very close to Kissinger does reveal a lot of information. And it goes into the fact that Kissinger rose from U.S. military intelligence from Nazi Germany to U.S. military intelligence to Harvard to the Rockefeller Empire to Nixon's White House and so forth. He never encountered violence from Nazis. This book says when he lived in Germany and was a young person, he came to the United States. He had close contacts in Firth, Germany, with a man named Harold Reisner, R-E-I-S-S-N-E-R, who became head of the Reisner Chemical Company in New York City. He moved in with a Christian family after the war. He had two close friends who were Protestants, Carl Friedrich and this Fritz Cramer. Friedrich was his professor of government at Harvard, and Cramer went on to the Pentagon to be political advisor, and as I say, the man who discovered Henry Kissinger. Kissinger became a United States citizen, and then when he was 22 went into Germany just as the war was winding down into U.S. Army intelligence. And in 1950s, he was teaching at Harvard University. I mentioned on another program that he was informing for the FBI and CIA on various students that were maybe too liberal or too left, as when he was a professor at Harvard, he was a snitch for the Defense Intelligence Agency. He left Harvard in 1954 to be on the Council of Foreign Relations in New York and write their policy under Nelson Rockefeller. And he was very close to a Ruhr businessman, this Cramer, who he knew. And this book describes him as a devout Christian, a noble Prussian, went to law school in Germany in 1933, had a Swedish wife. This is Fritz Cramer, who he sent to Great Britain when the war was coming down in Germany. He studied international law and got 2 PhDs in Italy. His wife came to Germany and got the family jewels and cash out. And in 1945, when Henry Kissinger came into Germany in May, when the war was over, Kissinger and Cramer were working together. In May 1943, the book, The Nazis Go Underground, describes the meetings of top Nazis to retrench because they realized that Hitler couldn't win the war against Russia. And it was about this time that Kissinger and Cramer made their connections. And then Cramer went on into the Pentagon to military political work as a strategist. And Kissinger's other friend, Carl Friedrich, was the professor at Harvard. Now, at Harvard University, Sven Cramer, that's the son of Fritz, the man who discovered Henry Kissinger, he had a son who was a student at Harvard of Henry Kissinger when he was teaching there. And then Sven, the father, is in the Pentagon. His son joined the National Security Council. He also worked under Lyndon Johnson in 1967 when Haig was brought into the National Security Council along with Butterfield, and then he became the aide to General Alexander Haig. So that Kissinger and Cramer and Haig and a group of people have been very close from the end of World War II up to the present time until they're managing our entire State Department these days. It was Haig. Among those who recommended Alexander Haig as Kissinger's deputy was Fritz Cramer, who worked with Haig in the early 60s in the Pentagon, and then also Cramer's son was a student of Kissinger's and recommended to the staff of Haig and National Security Council. So Sven Cramer, it was his son, worked with Haig and had high Pentagon positions, so that the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, being Alexander Haig, all were very cozy. The two Cramers and Haig and Kissinger have been close to this day. In a newspaper, the Revolutionary Worker, January 16th, 1981, there's an article, a background of Haig's past, and they described how he left NATO because it was too soft on the Soviet Union when he was working for Carter. He was the head of NATO. He married the daughter of a four-star general. He'd gone to West Point, but his political career brought him for a while into the camp of Robert Kennedy until the Bay of Pigs invasion. And then after John Kennedy was murdered, he jumped right from colonel to major general in 1969, working for Joseph Califano and Nixon and Kissinger, and took his position in the White House. As soon as Nixon won the election, finally in 1968, it was inaugurated in 1969. That's when Haig went into the White House, and that's when Butterfield was brought back from Australia, and Butterfield and Haig had been in the Pentagon together. He was promoted over 240 more senior officers. He became a four-star general, deputy chief of staff of the Army, and controlled the White House under Richard Nixon at the time that his buddy Alexander Butterfield was bugging Richard Nixon, and those tapes would remove Richard Nixon from being in office. There's an article by David Broder called The Haig Ego that was in the paper this Sunday, March 29th, and it tells about Haig working in the Army 17 years, and in 1964 going on to Washington and to the Pentagon and working for Joseph Califano. And there was a formula here. He had E equals the ego plus the White House equals trouble, that Haig knows too much, and he published Broder a formula about Haig working in the White House and now being in the State Department. He doesn't like just being in the State Department. Broder said Haig doesn't like being in the State Department because he knows too much about the White House inner workings, and he doesn't like to be that far isolated from all these other people strutting their stuff. Now, along with the problems of the Wells Fargo international connections from Japan to Nigeria and African countries, and this missing money and the Australian connections which link to Paisley and Bush and Haig and Pipes, along with that, other countries are having their problems. President Reagan!
Back up! Get him out! Get him out! Get him out! Get him out! Get the ambulance! All right, stay back! Get him back! Get the ambulance! I got one hand!
Rawhide is okay. Follow up. Rawhide is okay. Half back Roger. You want to go to the hospital or back to the White House? We're going to Crown. Okay. Back to the White House. Back to the White House. Rawhide is okay. Roger, we want to go to the emergency room of George Washington. That's the Roger. Go to George Washington fast.
Roger. Sergeant Dog, would you?
Get an ambulance. I mean, get the stretcher. Horsepower, you copy? GW. Correct, we've made the call. Horsepower. Let's hustle.
Shots were fired, apparently at President Reagan as he was coming out of the Washington Hilton Hotel this afternoon. The president was not hit. He was wounded. My God. He was, the president was hit. He is in stable condition. All this information, the president was hit.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and this is tape number 486. No, that was last week. It's tape 487, and it is April 1981, April the 5th, 1981. I was looking at the sheet that accompanied our broadcast last week when I was talking to you. You know, these are taped right off the air and put on tape cassettes, and I have the accompanying bibliography that's available for all of you if you want it, that goes with the tapes, with the sources of information and the date the articles were produced or the books and where I get my information, so that you know it isn't coming from the top of my head. It's really a series of reviews of things that I see in the paper and put together and share with you. And last week's tape I did on KLRB and took the printed sheet to be copied in Pacific Grove and left the cassette at the tape center. And the title of the printed sheet of last week's broadcast was "The Top Dogs Are Fighting Musical Chairs. Who will kill their team members off, or will they kill us first?" And in essence, last week what I was talking about was that it was absolutely necessary that this last week or immediately that the United States either have a military coup d'etat or go to war in Poland, because there is so much coming out in the news about the CIA and the assassination teams and the missing millions of dollars in the counterintelligence espionage that's been going on for the past 20 or 30 years, and specifically the last 10 years, that it was necessary to call a halt and shut up some of these investigations. And because George Bush was director of the Central Intelligence Agency and has a handle on all of this, and Mr. Haig can take care of the international situation, he wanted to be head of the crisis team before Ronald Reagan was shot and was pushed out. I realized that there would be some bullets flying, and I'll go into that in a few minutes. And if you want the tape of last week, you can get it. I won't repeat what I had on the air last week. I did mention that at the top of the sheet that Alexander Haig is angry. He wants both domestic and foreign emergency power and is ready for a quick move and a move in the White House. And all of you saw Alexander Haig this week taking over his constitutional succession, which he did not, in fact, get from the Constitution. On the sheet, I mentioned the importance of the scandals in Nigeria with counterintelligence money at this time linked to missing money in the Wells Fargo banks in California. And the father of John Hinckley was in Nigeria for a long period of time and has deep involvement in Biafra, Nigeria, for the Central Intelligence Agency. I didn't know the name Hinckley, but I knew Nigeria was involved. I also mentioned Tennessee as being a key point in this coup or junta, and he was also in Nashville, Tennessee, and had contacts and telephone calls there and was protected by the police. He was released in 34 minutes with a small fine, having weapons at the airport, 50 rounds of ammunition and 3 weapons. At the time the president was there, President Carter, in Nashville, Tennessee. In 34 minutes, he was not only released, but the FBI didn't tell the Secret Service that there was a John Hinckley. He had protection of the major law enforcement in the country. And I also connected missing money of the Wells Fargo Bank, $3.5 million, to Nashville, Tennessee. And he did indeed spend a lot of time in Hollywood, California. It was the Hollywood branch where this was missing. And I suggested that this was espionage money going directly to Nashville, Tennessee. And Hinckley went from Denver, Colorado, to California and spent 2 days there with whoever the contacts were. And I believe this is the final processing station for mind control of all the major assassinations coming down the pike. And then he went directly to Washington, D.C. So I was hitting the Hollywood branch of the Wells Fargo with espionage money, and the Tennessee connections and the Nigerian connections and General Haig and Bush and even more. And I was pretty close because that time, 12 hours later, I learned about Hinckley, but I didn't know who he was, but I knew that these were areas that had to be hushed up and were deeply involved in espionage. And to hear it in the morning news, just as one other newscast, was just an amazing thing, because unless you really studied this, you don't know how many years we have taken of crap from Jack Anderson and Robert Hartman, and they're still trying to pull it with you now. They're trying to say that that coup this week, or this attempted coup, was because this assassin, or would-be assassin, and I'll refer to him as an assassin, because I don't think Ronald Reagan is going to pull through this in the long run. He's going to die as a result of it. So I'm going to refer to him as the assassin and the coup, and tell you why. But these people want to tell you that he had a crush for Jodie Foster, and the motive is solved, never going into the links of the family, the money, the travels, the telephone calls, the contracts, the weapons, the Nazi connections that we'll cover this week and next week as much as we can. Now, about that gunning down of Ronald Reagan this week, many of you read, of course, the relationship of Neil Bush to Scott Hinckley, the brother of John Hinckley that shot Ronald Reagan on the street. Mr. Bush, our vice president, George Bush, says that they were just casual acquaintances. They were going to have dinner the night after the assassination was to take place. If Reagan was murdered on Monday, they had scheduled a dinner together in the home of Bush's son in Denver, Colorado, and Scott Hinckley was friendly with the Bush family. The news media, you notice, is playing this very lightly and going into the Jodie Foster story. I remember at the time that when Sirhan was arrested in Los Angeles, and Mayor Yorty exclaimed, "It's a communist that killed Robert Kennedy," because Sirhan's brother was parked down the street from where some suspected Reds lived, and therefore that was a communist conspiracy, having his car on the street. But you get a wall of silence now when the Bushes and the Hinkleys know each other, one working for Standard Oil of Indiana and the other having much in common with George Bush. What do they have in common? Because George Bush would succeed if Ronald Reagan dies from poisons that were in that bullet, and I believe there were. They have oil money, lots of oil money, and energy in common. They have the CIA in common. I believe the Hinckley family is totally a CIA operation. I went into the chronology of that family very carefully, at least what's come out so far. They lived in Dallas, Texas, and had a lot of money, a $200,000 or $300,000 home. He worked as a volunteer for an African, in Biafra in Africa, for a church group from Southern California. And yet he was a tiny oil and gas company with a big home. The Wall Street Journal describes the money they had in 1973 when they moved to Denver, Colorado, and the holdings for the company was half of the price of the home they lived in, while he did volunteer work in Nigeria with a Christian group in California. But we'll do more on the thickness of the CIA in common. George Bush was director of the CIA, and I believe that the Hinckley family was deeply involved with the Central Intelligence Agency. He headed a president of the Vanderbilt Energy, it's called, and at the time of the shooting of Ronald Reagan, Vanderbilt Energy was under investigation by the federal agency for $2 million overcharge. Imagine a federal government investigating hours before the president is killed, a corporation in Denver, Colorado, and the son of the president of that corporation is meeting the next evening after the feds are there with the son of the vice president of the United States. They had Texas in common. Hinckley made his money in Texas, lived in Dallas, Texas. George Bush is from Texas, and they had Nigeria in common because of the contacts of Biafra and John Hinckley Sr., and also the problems in Nigeria and Angola that the CIA was having also at the time of Jonestown, that Leo Ryan exposed as being actually anti-Castro Cubans and not Castro Cubans down in Angola. George Bush is from Texas, and the night or the day that Ronald Reagan was to be killed or planned to be killed, Bush was out there in Fort Worth, Texas, at the time, the old home territory where Hinckley grew up and the family lived. They have the CIA in common in the terms of Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney for the Central Intelligence Agency, and I'll do more about Williams in a minute. He was John Connolly's attorney at the time of Watergate. He was a Washington Post attorney at the time. Deep Throat was working, and they were squeezing Richard Nixon out to get Alexander Haig and Mr. Butterfield into control of the White House at the time. They've hired the highest attorney of the Central Intelligence Agency to represent their son, when the man who would have succeeded if the son had killed him was the former director of the CIA, and there really are no ex-CIA people. At the time, Richard Helms was charged with perjury, lying about the killing of Allende down in Chile. Williams represented him, too. And this week, if Reagan gets better, or soon, he was to entertain Mr. Pinochet, the man who killed Salvador Allende down in Chile. There is a thick can of worms between Richard Helms, the CIA, and George Bush, who became director of the CIA, and Williams, who was the attorney for Richard Helms, who is representing the Hinckley family and their son at this time. The prosecutor on this case, at least the first one that John Hinckley Jr. saw, is Charles Ruff, who did a miserable job prosecuting the Watergate defendants, and they all got off easy. And because there's direct links to the entire Watergate team of Butterfield, Haig, and Bush, I don't see that anyone associated with, from the John Kennedy assassination up to Watergate and beyond, should be handling this case at all. And, of course, Standard Oil of Indiana is involved because of George Bush's son being a director of Standard Oil of Indiana, and that company was involved in the plane crash of Dorothy Hunt, the bagwoman for the CIA at the time of Watergate. And if Dorothy Hunt had lived, maybe none of these people would be in power today. They're in power because the secrets were stopped, and when they blew up her plane, they learned how to silence a lot of other people that had information. So that this military junta had a very nice package there with George Bush and Alexander Haig, and I think it is a disgrace that this family was so close and intimate in Denver, Colorado, and uses a CIA attorney and seems to be a CIA dummy front. And Ronald Reagan is gunned down with these people just right behind the scenes, ready to pick up the pieces. There was an article in the San Jose Mercury, Who is John Hinckley? And it goes into a belief that he was a drug user in Denver, Colorado. That was one of the points they brought out. Well, so were the Hells Angels, and so were the Nazi parties and the Manson family and what they call the street people. He belonged to the Nazi party. He was part of their stormtrooper. He had a lot of activity with the far right wing, and one way they finance their activity in their travels is by dealing drugs and weapons, and we've talked about that on many programs. Now, Mr. and Mrs. John W. Hinckley, the parents, let out a little trial balloon in the newspaper through a friend this week. This was a United Press story in Associated Press, April the 4th. And I'll have a few quotations here that remind me of veiled threats that William Colby was giving Howard Baker at the time of Watergate if they went too far into their investigations. And these are from this newspaper article in quotes. It says, the parents may break their silence soon after they see their son. They've hired CIA attorney Edward Bennett Williams, and they may soon break their silence. The next quotation is, they would not divulge their exact plans, but they indicated that after they saw their son, they would go to Washington, D.C. before next week. William Sells, a neighbor, said, it is not appropriate for me to reveal any element of their plans. He also said, once the Hinckleys visit their son, they will consider a suitable arrangement to feed the press if their lawyers agree. These came over with all the wire services this last week. They also said a doctor who was a family friend from the start of the shooting of Ronald Reagan, when they found out their son was involved, came to the house but said the parents required no special treatment at this time. I imagine that if they're going to blackmail the CIA or get involved in the scandalous operation of their own company, where Mr. Hinckley quickly stepped away, they took the names off the doors, he walked out, there's no identification with him to the company, that Vanderbilt Energy, he's closed shop and run away. That is silly behavior for a man who has 1/6 son to leave a $4.5 million operation, unless you're so deeply involved in the intelligence system that you have to get out, just as the dummy fronts had to do at the time that Watergate was falling apart. Another quotation was, the Hinckleys talked with their son by telephone twice. Now, so far, John Hinckley hasn't killed anybody, and I did a lot of work with prisoners and prison reform for a long time, and it was very few people except Dan White and the John Hinckley's that get telephones where they're in contact with their parents and family. It isn't that easy. Another part of this article said a week before the shooting, John left his car in the family garage and indicated to his parents he was going to California. All the articles up to now, this is Sunday and the shooting took place Monday, have him taking a Delta airline into Nashville, Tennessee, either from Atlanta, Georgia, or Chicago, taking American Airline from Nashville, Tennessee, either to New Haven, Connecticut, or New York, taking a $33 taxi ride in Nashville from the airport to a hotel. And outside of that, there hasn't been any message of what kind of car he drives or what he has, but he has a car, and he was deeply in touch with his family right up to the time he went to California. He never worked except 1 week in his life, and the car is left at the family house, but he carried on by foot or thumb or espionage wherever he went, and this is a period of 6 or 7 years that are unaccounted for, except for picking up Mein Kampf and Nazi meetings in St. Louis, Missouri, and checking into a university occasionally from 1973 to 1980 until the fall. He had a lot of time to learn how to shoot. They had a lot of time to do mind control. They had a lot of time to train him for kamikaze work, too. And that is one of the clues to this kind of operation, was the use of kamikaze, and I'll go into that in a minute. The family said that they have no indication of his hostile acts before, but they will go to Washington, and as I say, they will consider a suitable arrangement to feed the press if their lawyers agree, and their attorney is this Edward Bennett Williams, who's had the most important CIA cases for the director of the CIA, William Telbs, at the time of the Watergate, of any attorney in the United States, and that's a lot of it. So they're setting out their veiled threats, and I'll do more about this. I will refer to him as the assassin and tell you why I don't think Ronald Reagan is going to pull through this easily. We'll take a break now at the end of the first 30 minutes, and we'll do some more about Ronald Reagan's assassination attempt and the prognosis for the future, and John Hinckley and his family.
What you're listening to now is May Brussell, episode number 487. You just heard Side A, and you're getting ready to hear Side B. Now, what this is the first episode after the Reagan assassination attempt. And because she recorded these on cassettes, they're split up between Side A and Side B. So here's May with Side B.
Okay, this is May, back for 30 more minutes on the events that took place this last week. Typical of Ronald Reagan, when he was well enough to ask questions about who gunned him down, he asked the usual question, what is the demographic description of my near assassin? That means, tell me, please, he's a communist, tell me he's a Jew, is he black, is he on welfare? Give me that demographic, geographic, Latino, let's get going with it. We can't condone violence, okay? But the CIA wasn't very nice to Ronald Reagan this time. I mean, they were really upfront. They said, Your Majesty, I hate to tell you, but he's blonde and he's got blue eyes and he's been going to college for the last 6 years, and he's from Texas, oil money, very rich, home worth $200,000. His father is president of Vanderbilt Energy in Denver, Colorado, and his children, friends of Vice President Bush. Devoutly Christian family. The father supports Christian groups and organizations. They live in a white Christian neighborhood. He's had all that money could buy. He loves the Nazi Party, and he reads Mein Kampf, and he goes as a stormtrooper in St. Louis and Chicago. And he's not a welfare cheater. He's the all-American boy, the good Christian family Boy Scout. You wouldn't want more. That's the demographic description of your near assassin. And then Ronald Reagan says, put another tube in. I can't handle it. What am I going to do with these good Christian Americans? I mean, how do you know where to look for people anymore? But it's so typical of his mentality. But if he went a little further, when he was head of the Rockefeller Committee to investigate assassinations after Watergate, he would have known that Lee Harvey Oswald worked with Mr. Rockwell of the American Nazi Party, and that James Earl Ray worked with Nazis in St. Louis and down in Memphis, Tennessee. Also, and that Sirhan worked with the Greek Orthodox Church and the CIA conduit, Richard Nixon's friends, that brought them all to Pasadena. And he would also look back in history and know that the same profile of this Hinckley that you don't hear about on the media is exactly like all the other violences they pull. That Whitman boy in the Tower of Texas, John Conley, took his brains and sent them to Boston as an excuse to experiment on blacks to see while they riot. He was a good Christian, a Boy Scout, a perfect youth, no trouble until he started shooting at the Texas University, and that began the real mind control program of the United States that moved from Boston to UCLA that Ronald Reagan was inaugurating with his Dr. Jolly West, who also came in on the SLA case as the great expert and now has quotations in the news about John Hinckley. The Manson family, the same thing. Charles Manson didn't kill those people. In Los Angeles, Tex Watson, choir boy, good Christian, came from Texas, went out to California, worked with Beverly Hills attorneys. Who would guess he'd come in your home at night, Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca, and get your stomachs cut open and put helter-skelter and try to make it look like the Beatles and the Black Panthers did it? John Warnock Hinckley isn't any different than all the others who've been trained to kill, who've been brought up in this racist society by the intelligence community with their minds controlled. That Dr. Shock that was operating on people in Jonestown without anesthetic, with enough drugs for a population of 60,000, and there were only less than 1,000 there. He came from Houston, Texas, too, and went to medical school in California. And the man who killed Alan Lowenstein, former congressman in New York, was also from California, brainwashed through mind control programs that picked up his weapon out in Houston, Texas. Texas and California have strong patterns together, and if Ronald Reagan didn't know that now, he never will, so it's just too bad. But as Alan Dulles said at the first meeting of the Warren Commission, he brought a book for them to read on past assassinations, and he said, gentlemen, there's a pattern that runs through all these, and if you understand these past assassinations based on my little book that was started in 1954, that's when the CIA was overthrowing Mossadegh and putting in the Shah. He says, if you read this book, you'll see that there's a pattern running through these assassinations. And the CIA has made sure that they give you the patterns and not the hospitals and the location of where they get their guns and so forth. Alan Dulles brought that to the meeting. And John J. McCloy, president of Chase Manhattan Bank on the Warren Commission, said, well, the Lincoln assassination was a plot. And Alan Dulles said, yes, but one man was so dominant that it almost wasn't a plot. Isn't that pathetic? A man that was an executive of the OSS, the CIA, that formed these teams, who's telling the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Mr. Chairman, and John J. McCloy of Chase Manhattan Bank, it was so dominant it almost wasn't a plot. And that's exactly what you get with this John Warlock Hinkle. His name is, I call him Warlock Hinkle for reasons that I will get into this week or next week. Now, when these assassination attempts take place, I keep a chronology. If you hear paper rattling, it's because I've just brought in the large charts instead of cards to share with you. And I make a chronology going down a huge tablet from 1970 to 1981, all the activity of the Hinckley family, and every article that falls in about them or where they were, I put it into those time slots. Then I break it down even further into John Hinckley from September 1980 up through March 81, and every article that has him at a certain location at a certain time, because you find all of a sudden it overlays, and then the major classifications that I study each and every one of these assassinations falls into important questions to ask that remain unanswered, and then 17 years later, as in the Kennedy assassination, they'll tell you, yes, there was a conspiracy. They're major questions such as, what did John Warnock Hinckley Sr. do before 1970 in Dallas, Texas, to pay for the $250,000 home? If he was doing volunteer work in Africa and Biafra, how did he buy the home, and who paid for him? Because when he moved up to Denver, Colorado, according to Wall Street Journal, he had $120,000 in asset in 1970, and he moved immediately into a very expensive area and always had money, and you don't get that volunteering for some little church group in Nigeria, believe me. So the question is, how did he get his money? So I have a huge page of important questions on these people. Then I break down the real motives for the assassination attempt. Cui bono, who gains? It's certainly, it's a very obvious line of succession here of people that have been clawing for power. As a matter of fact, George Bush and Haig both wanted to be president. and didn't get the nomination. So there's nothing they'd like better besides having direct links to these people through the intelligence agency and the Defense Department and being so darn obvious about it this time. They both want to be president, and they will be president. I break down the links of this person, John Hinckley, to the military, the evidence that he's under mind control, where he got it, and the telephone messages of different people, different cities, the links of this person to the Defense Department and the CIA, the locations of the cities where he's been, such as Evergreen, Colorado, Yale University at New Haven, Lubbock, Texas, Nashville, Tennessee, back to Denver, Colorado, and Los Angeles, California, Atlanta, Georgia, Chicago with the Nazi Party, St. Louis with the Nazi Party. And I take the various trips and the modus operandi of the traveling, and then the case, are there other people involved? That column, for example, under each space, I put the source of the information, like San Francisco Chronicle, April the 4th, 1981. They said he may have been involved with somebody else in Washington, D.C. before he went to the Hilton Hotel. There were 2 local telephone calls from his room on Monday. He stayed 2 blocks from the White House. Before leaving, he said, are there any messages? Then April the 2nd, the Los Angeles Times said that the Justice Department in Denver is keeping a search warrant going over documents under seal, telling the FBI it is investigating John Hinckley and possibly others. The papers contain information that, if revealed publicly, could hamper their investigation. This is the Assistant U.S. Attorney Susan Roberts. The L.A. Times had an article that Hinckley received funds from wealthy parents, but he also got from other sources, but they won't say other persons who. He would pawn a dagger and pick up a few $100s, but that hardly paid for airplane fare, hotel fare, and contacts. So he was intermittently getting money, according to the bank records, from parents and others. But they will not say who the and others are, but money was coming into his account. Los Angeles Times had an article April the 2nd. His checking account records from 1979 to 1980, that's when he started picking up the weapons, most of it is from his parents. See, this is just one column of others involved. So everything that I see in all the newspapers I'm getting, I put the source and the intimation that there's someone else involved. Another article in the L.A. Times from Nashville, Tennessee, he paid cash for his hotel, $30.73. He made 6 local telephone calls in Tennessee. He knows somebody there. He made them from that hotel. He stayed one day, then he checked at another hotel. There's a chance that there are doubles involved, and I have a column on that, because a person believed to be John Hinckley was in Hollywood at a Hollywood motel. A person running that hotel said he was there in the afternoon of the 23rd, and John Hinckley didn't get there until 5 o'clock to the L.A. airport. So this person was seeing a John Hinckley earlier. And also, they said he left Denver to be with friends in California, and friends and neighbors mentioned that he had friends in California, and they're not talking about it. Also, he made local calls, as I say, before checking out of Nashville at the Opryland Hotel. And the Secret Service was there because Jimmy Carter was going to be at the hotel, so he checked to the Downtown or Central Hotel, where he made 3 local calls in his room. He made 3 there, and then they didn't determine from the time he checked out of the hotel, which is 15 minutes from the airport, until he left Nashville to go either to New Haven, Connecticut, or New York. He had 2 hours, which is unaccounted. So there's a question of others involved. He was seeing someone. There was someone that resembled him in another location, and they were wrong about the time. And another record said that he left his home in Denver, Colorado, March 25th, and said, I'm going to California. And then the next day he took the Greyhound bus to go to Washington, D.C. Well, that is untrue. Somebody by the name of John Hinckley was in California on the 23rd of March, and he left after the 25th to go to Washington, D.C. So always in this story, there are people, lookalikes, who look like them, and I keep a record of them. Now, last week, I'll go some more on the charts and questions with you for the next few weeks and show you maybe have a diagram for you of the funding, the income, the family backgrounds, and as I say, the chronology, the modus operandi, where they get the weapons, and links to the police department or the FBI and the government, and then come down with a composite of who this I call him John Warlock Hinckley instead of Warnock Hinckley. Now, last week, what preceded the shooting of Ronald Reagan? Newsweek had a cover which is dated April the 6th, 1981. And on the cover is General Haig. And when you know how to read the news media, you get a pretty good idea of what's coming down. Now, I didn't see this when I was on KLRB Sunday night. It came out Monday, but there's a cover story of General Haig titled, "Who is in Charge Here? Power Struggle in the White House. Haig versus the White House." And there's a reference in there to kamikaze actions in the article in the Newsweek. Now, that's interesting because there's a rock group in Denver, Colorado that John Hinckley was particularly close to called the Kamikaze Clones. And I've seen movies of kamikaze clones of Idi Amin trained by the CIA in Uganda. And the letter that he left at his hotel, that telltale diary letter saying the president will be killed and he wants to die. And there's a lot of talk about death. In that letter, he's ready to die. And he was linked to, very closely associated to the kamikaze clones. And also the word kamikaze was in the Newsweek this last week. They also had a picture of Jodie Foster in Newsweek this past week on page 88. She's the girl at Yale University that he was supposed to be infatuated with. The FBI, incidentally, was saying that they're absolutely sure there was no conspiracy, but they wouldn't be this firm next time. There's a quotation to the effect that they'll withhold it. They're sure there's no conspiracy, but they'll hold back this time until they're absolutely positive. Newsweek also had a picture of Ronald Reagan in his riding habit, and he's smiling and going off to ride his horse. That scene was taken before he was airlifted to Quantico, Virginia, to the Marine base. And it's very interesting that as soon as John Warnock Hinckley was arrested, instead of staying in a jail in Washington, D.C., like all the other assassins or would-be assassins are placed, he was taken out to Quantico, Virginia, to the same Marine base where Ronald Reagan was a few days earlier. It's one reason to believe that the CIA and the military is highly involved in this. They separated him from everybody else, and even when a president is killed, the suspect is not taken to a military base. With the combination of Edward Bennett Williams of the CIA and the Marine base, he's much in control of the military, who are now giving him Valium plus other prescription of medication, so that when he gets his tests or interviews, I'm sure that his little brain will be completely erased of whatever it was he did or who he knew before he was in front of the Hilton Hotel last week. As I say, last week I mentioned that the shooting would start, but the Washington Post had an article, and they also were so instrumental in sliding Richard Nixon out and making ready for Haig and Butterfield and this new team at the time of Watergate. The Washington Post had a front-page story the day of the assassination attempt, and many of their staff are full-time CIA people, and they worked with Deep Throat and the Central Intelligence Agencies at the height of Watergate, pulling a lot of shenanigans. The Washington Post had a story on George Bush, and besides the front page, they had an entire full page of the newspaper called "The Team Player, George Bush, How the Outsider Quietly Moved to the Inside." Well, a few bullets and he'll be inside. It wasn't very quiet if you saw a replay of the events. And there was George Bush, former director of the CIA, a Texas oil man, former ambassador to China, out of Fort Worth at the time of the shooting, friends of the Hinckley family, and he's ready to take over. And they had a full-page picture of him, and they had Haig on the cover of Newsweek, which is owned by Washington Post, and a full page of Bush, as if they were just really ready to take over. And speaking of Edward Bennett Williams, I mentioned besides John Connally that he was an attorney for at the time of Watergate. He also was attorney for Bobby Baker, for Gulf and Western, for Jimmy Hoffa, for Senator Joe McCarthy, who worked with Roy Cohn and David Schein, and the Washington Post, and the whole Texas Connally, Bush, Haig, Counterintelligence, Defense Department, CIA assassination team. This whole gang were just out there ganged up against Ronald Reagan, and that's why I think he's going to have a hard time surviving. That's why I read on the air last week the names of the large group of military people and armament builders who were at a dinner that Jody Jacobs described for Alexander Haig in her column in the LA Times just the week before the shooting. And I suggested that with this kind of brass behind Bush, how long does Ronald Reagan have to live? Now, there's a lot of energy and a lot of money behind Alexander Haig. And he got up in front of that microphone, and I don't have to repeat what he said. You heard him. And he took the power. He said the Constitution gave him that power to take over if Vice President Bush was in Texas. If he had just said, I will answer your questions until Vice President Bush comes, that would have been adequate. But he used the Constitution and threw that in as the cloak for his taking authority. And there was certainly guilt and trembling behind the old battle man's face. And I wondered if he realized at the time how visible he was, and that the thing the American people feared so much was his links to Watergate, to the past, removing of Ronald Reagan, the way he did it, the way he took over from Robert Haldeman. I never was a Reagan, I mean Richard Nixon. I get the two so confused because the teams are so lopsided and similar. I believe that this old, tired actor, he spent 35 years getting in office to be in 3 months before he was gunned down like a dog. I do want to mention briefly before I get back to the Hinckley family, and as I say, I'll do a lot more next week, my fears for Ronald Reagan. You saw 4 men shot, 3 reacted one way, and 1 walked or was pushed into a car. But according to some stories, he was still on his feet when he went into the hospital. And I believe if the bullets all came from the same person, they would respond almost similarly to the way they were shot. But Ronald Reagan went a different way, and I believe that there was a different person that shot him. I'm afraid that it will have a poison on it, that he will die from a poisoning. You remember the shooting of Dr. Foster, the SLA, up in Oakland, where Dr. Foster got a cyanide bullet and Dr. Blackburn, his buddy, got a regular bullet. And Foster died immediately. But I think that there could be a lingering death, such as Woodrow Wilson had, or a poison, or a collapsed lung. I'm afraid, not the oxide, or maybe the oxide on the bullet, and the FBI didn't tell the doctors for 3 days the composition of the bullet in one of the men who still had it in his body, or what was in the president at the time they were cleaning out the wounds. 4 men were shot, and 1 responded totally differently. And I'm afraid that something is going to happen to him as a result of not the direct hit that would be too drastic, make us look like a banana republic, but slowly he'll take naps, he'll have bleeding or coughing of the lung, and he'll be weak from now on. I don't think he's going to have the strength that he should have. The other thing I was worried about when I saw television and the replays, bringing in several quarts of blood for Ronald Reagan. 4 people had been gunned down seriously. 1 of them went to another hospital, but it showed a car coming in with 2.5 quarts for Reagan. Why not bring in 50 quarts for 3 people who are going to have a lot of surgery? He lost half of his blood, but what came to my mind, that deja vu, was at the time of Watergate when Herbert Kalmbach, the attorney for the White House, took Martha Mitchell out to a hospital near Long Beach, and she had an ejection. And my first public article was, why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped? Because I thought she would get a Jack Ruby type of cancer from the needle shot that she had, that she was physically abducted. And later James McCord revealed that everything I had said in that article was true, and that she was a prisoner. And I could see her in 3 years having that terminal, terrible cancer, and isolated from her own daughter until she died. She never saw her. So I was worried if there was a special blood. If he didn't die from the gun, is he getting a special blood? The Overthrow magazine put out in New York by A.J. Weberman had a contest when Reagan became president. It's called the Reagan Death Watch Begins, and they give various prizes. And you could predict, you filled out a square, how would he die? By botulism, CIA shellfish fish toxin administered by George Bush, phlebitis, such as Reagan said, if I go in the hospital, they'll kill me. Would he get lost flying backward in time? Would he have skin cancer from Grecian formula hair dye? Would he fall off his horse at the ranch? Maybe at Quantico at the Marine base. They have a list of all kinds of ways that Ronald Reagan would die, and you could almost fill in these squares. Now it's called the Death Watch, and your prize, you could get out of jail free card, you could get a $220,000 bribe from Libyans, immunity from prosecution, a construction for the Malcolm X missile, bribe an FBI agent disguised as an Arab sheik. You could get away with that. You can have an American tourister luggage and ticket to New Zealand, or a congressional investigation of your choice, or it had a list of prizes if you guessed the way the president would be killed. And A.J. Weberman has a picture of a skull called the Seal of the President of the United States, with a skull in the center and Mickey Mouse on top. The Reagan death watch begins. But when you talk about the shellfish toxin and the botulism or the poison, I thought of the blood, and often in humor, the very serious things are said in jest, but they are really true. This warning of that psychic, Tamara Rand, out in Los Angeles. She works in L.A. and Las Vegas and out of Atlanta, Georgia, using her hypnotism and ESP. She was found to be a fake, where she said last week that she had predicted January the 6th that Ronald Reagan would be shot in March. But she let out a word which I listened to for clues, because when these things come down, there are certain messages there. And she said he'll have a relapse in July. So I'm marking my calendar, because maybe Tamara Rand and her Institute of Hypnosis will be back in business in July, because if she was lying in January, she'll be right in July. I don't know whether she took that from inside work that she knows, or after the shooting. She was on the air saying this, but she's given it a date, and I think it's something to consider. And I think it fits in with all the humor about Ronald Reagan, saying he would rather be in Philadelphia, or if he knew he'd get so much attention, he would have stayed in Hollywood. Or the silly remarks, the reunion of parties. The news people are picking up jokes and quips, and how he walked in and look how strong this 70-year-old man is. The truth was that he couldn't breathe. He said he wasn't getting oxygen. They didn't send an ambulance for him. Usually you put someone flat and call an ambulance so that they get oxygen or blood if they need it. When he got to the hospital, there was blood coming out of his nose. There was blood coming out of his mouth. He couldn't get air. It was a serious situation. The FBI waited 3 days to tell what kind of bullets were in him. The FBI did not tell the Secret Service that they knew about this person all along. And I have a list of the involvement of the police, the federal agents, and the Secret Service in this miserable story. So I don't think that Ronald Reagan is out of it yet. If the intent was to get him, if the people in power couldn't win the nomination, if they want the power, if they want to stop the scandals at the CIA, the missing millions of money, the names I've been talking about, the counterintelligence operations, if they have to conceal the bankruptcy, the emotional and financial bankruptcy that this country is really in now, it would take a war in Russia, against Russia, or a coup d'etat, or a diversion of a sort, and then the new person in would get carte blanche, and we would give them a year of grace, and they would tighten up their act and wipe out a lot of their witnesses. You can expect quite a few murders or related assassinations to this story, I believe. Now, this is a serious attempt to kill Ronald Reagan after he was in power just 3 months. As I sent a letter to somebody this week, he tried 35 years to be president, and they gave him 3 months. But when you have somebody such as Alexander Haig, who was discovered by Fritz Cramer and Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi intelligence system, and George Bush, the former ambassador to China, and director of the CIA, when you have those people there, they think they know Washington, they have the power. You send in a 70-year-old tired actor who didn't do his lines well, who simply loves his horses and his jelly beans, who relegates power, who doesn't care about the details of the activities going on as long as there's a pleasantness, and the news media is feeding it to make him look good, and he can twist their arm and give speeches to the Academy and be ever present in the media, smiling and waving, coming and going on the balcony, entertaining heads of states. When it comes to push and shove and the system's falling apart, they've got to kill the old goat. He's an outsider like Jimmy Carter. These guys have been in Washington from the day one. They know the congressman, they know the espionage system, they know the Justice Department, they know the defense agencies, they know the CIA, and this guy is expendable. He's literally a clown with world figures. He's a movie actor, and they're down to the hard knuckle. Should we get to war and tighten up, and it will solve unemployment, it will solve the diversionary process for things that have gone on, all the failures of foreign policy in Central America, South America, Middle East, and it would be hard to pull it with this old goat. I think they intended to kill him. I don't think he'll live long. I think there's every indication medically that he's going to have relapses, and the reason they gave us these jokes was so when it comes later, he sort of eases out of it. Now, we're in a very serious crisis in this country. We can't solve it in 1 hour. I've been trying for 17 years. I've been sharing with you for 9 years, going on 10, and I will continue to do it. And it's interesting. Study it and read the papers. Don't fall for the cover story, America's violent, or we need gun control, or Jodie Foster inspired him. Read where the guy gets his money. Read where the family gets their money. Collect the stories of the travels, the fascist connections, and then you'll know who's behind one more assassination attempt in the United States of America. And it will go on until we wise up and demand that they stop some of this hanky-panky. Well, the time is up now. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week on the John Hinckley family. In the meantime, take care.
That episode was recorded about 5 or 6 days after the Reagan assassination attempt, and listen how much information she has already gathered. Now, this one is about a month and a week after. This is episode 491, recorded May 3rd, 1981, and this one is much more Haig-centric. And her notes for this are, watch Haig, silence about Reagan assailant, chronology of Haig's giant leap into the White House, how long back was Reagan presidency arranged, Reagan and Meiklejohn, 1937, and like Nixon, a question. Those are the notes. Here's Mae Brussell.
Well, I do want to go into the shootout at the Old Corral. I think that is terribly important, the Corral being the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. And the more silent the news media is, the angrier I get about it. But one more item, or a couple of items before we get to that, is that among all the bad news and the power struggle of Alexander Haig and the talk of World War III, there are journalists and newspapers and people now moving, catching on to Haig and Weinberger and Walter Stessel and Mr. Allen and Mr. Casey and that clique around Richard Nixon and the rhetoric of Nixon getting the Russians for the first 30 days in the administration, and then after that just pounding away. But there are some articles, and I don't mean single columns or letters to the editor, but what I noticed last week is that there were 3 almost entire half-page articles, and I'll read you the titles, and one a full-page ad for the New York Times, which I think is beginning to show the sentiments of some people. One was April 26th for the New York Times, and the large headline type was, "Some mavericks question the relevance of armed forces strategy and hardware. Is a gung-ho the way to go?" And finally, this was a half page that some are questioning the relevance of the things that the Pentagon wants. Another article from the Los Angeles Times, a full half page on the 29th of April. Foreign policy should consist of more than anti-Sovietism. That this is all we're getting, and very interesting distinctions of some serious problems. Very good articles, a half page. Another one, again from the New York Times, entire half page, April 26th. There may be more to foreign policy than stopping the Soviets. It sounds like the other one above, but one's the New York Times and one's the Los Angeles Times. One written by James Chase, another by Bernard Wertzman. And then this article is titled also Disputing the Vicar. Alexander Haig calls himself the Vicar of the United States. His brother is a priest at Loyola in Washington, D.C., and he's on the board of directors there, a Catholic priest, but he refers to himself as the Vicar of the United States. And then finally, a full-page ad in the New York Times. And if you have your pencil, write this address down, because you should be used to having a pencil if you listen to me on there. If not, you can call or write me a letter and get it. It's a full-page ad in the New York Times, Sunday, April 26, written by William Myers and Joseph Schwartz, called Coalition for a Decent USA. The address, you can send a contribution, and I'll tell you what it is about. 420 Lexington Avenue, room 2060, New York, New York, 10017. And there's a large cartoon of Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, and Ronald Reagan, and George Bush and Alexander Haig, and they're playing with war toys, and they're winding them up. And then on the floor, they have their toys moving about. But the thing that impressed me about the full-page ad was a list of questions, and it appealed to me because my objection to many of the movements that are going today are that today there was a demonstration against El Salvador. Tomorrow it'll be Save the Whales. The next day it's against the nuclear plant down at San Luis Obispo or Rhode Island or you name it. Another time against the nuclear weapons up at Lawrence Livermore Lab. And people are not capable of confronting the entire fabric of the problems as a total problem and face what the problems are and the people behind them. I talk every week on this program about the people behind the problems and how they cause the problems. But this ad for a coalition for a decent USA, I'll read you some of the things they say, but the final sentence they ask is, can a president who is basically a decent man pursue policies that are not? And they make several points. They brought out the inflation that is going to eat away your pocketbook and your life savings, the billions that are put on armaments, that the most inflationary kind of purchasing is spending on weapons where no consumer goods or services are used. They ask, how do you stop inflation to spend billions on the military, and how do you help by cutting social programs? How is that anti-inflationary? Where does it help? Are nuclear wars fightable? Are they winnable? You know, for the Pentagon to say we'll settle for 20 million dead, who is to decide which ones are the 20 millions, and is that a victory? Is it winnable at all? Do our leaders toy with our lives and not their own when they talk of winning a nuclear war by letting 20 million die? Are we more secure today after decades of producing nuclear weapons? The argument for having them was that they make us secure. Are we more secure now that we have them and we've dropped it? Now, well, South Africa has it, and if Libya has one, and Syria and Pakistan and India and Argentina and Brazil, and you go on and on, are you going to be secure because they have them? They said, would we be more secure if we straightened our economy and strengthened it and got it going instead? Would it be more decent to use armament billions to fight hunger and poverty, in the world? And this is the contradiction I spent so much time with on the air last week talking about the Werner Erhard program, or World Vision, or these great food programs that bring in a few grains to people and leave and promise them a happy road to the next life, an easier passage through death and starvation without giving them the means of controlling their own life and their production and taking the things from their earth, the minerals in earth, back for their own houses and schools instead of flying in like great angels and dropping some seeds into their hungry mouth. And the more devout, the more religious the church group, the more they support the radical right that wants the weapons and the armaments that keep these countries impoverished. We sell them any kind of piece of junk or hardware, whether we need it or not, and sell them the Bibles and the church with it and the missionaries that turn them Christian before they die. And they ask the question, these people, a coalition for a decent USA, is it more decent to use armament billions for fighting hunger and poverty? Then they said, should we challenge the Soviet Union to join in a campaign of escalation of weapons, or do we want to match weapon for weapon? Does this make sense? Does our government care that small business will be going bankrupt because of record high interest and mortgage rates? We can't buy a house. You can't rent an apartment. Our savings are jeopardized by the losses suffered in the savings institutions. More businesses are going under. Will the oil companies and use their profits to buy up our businesses as they go under? This is what Chase Manhattan, Rockefeller, and various banks did during the Depression. When the farmers migrated and moved and left those farms, they bought up those farms. And the businesses that thrive, this coalition says, are the oil companies and the military hardware, and do they control these prices to buy up our bankrupt businesses? Is there a serious threat to the environment having people like James G. Watt for Interior Secretary and Ann Gorsuch as Administrator of the Environmental Agency? Will the cuts in welfare be counterproductive? Will the working poor have no incentive and put them back on full-time welfare? Should our government be abandoning cities, education, housing, health, transportation, the minorities, and tell us to fend for themselves? Now, I'm reading all of this to you because it hits many of the basic things that I see happening by the systematic assassination of particular people who would not allow these things to escalate. We have permitted butchers to get into office who have no regard for your oil prices, your energy, your utilities, your savings, your bank accounts, your health, your housing, your education, your clean air, your transportation. They're taking away the Amtrak, the funds for the Amtrak, they raise the price of the airplane ticket. We'll be cut off from each other by taking the means of getting to each other away from us. And what is accomplished, and they ask the question at the end, can a president who is basically a decent man pursue this kind of a escalation? Now, you have to go under the assumption that maybe Ronald Reagan is basically a decent man, but maybe we have to do a little bit more homework into where Ronald Reagan came from. In the meantime, you can write to Coalition for a Decent USA. I hope they're not a CIA front. I wouldn't know. I don't know who these people are, and sometimes these things that sound too good to be true are simply vacuums that take your name. But you might send them $1 or $5 or ask for literature. Coalition for a Decent USA, 420 Lexington Avenue, room 2060, New York, New York, 10017. There's one thing I know is that if the leaders aren't decent, then the people have to take their life into their own hands. So if you are not treated fairly, there's no way to impeach them unless you catch them in crimes again, such as Richard Nixon, and pull out some of the current crimes or the past crimes. But if they control the Justice Department and the CIA and the FBI tight enough, and you can't break through, that it's up to the people to get together. And I suggest writing to this organization and see what it's about, because certainly we need a coalition for a decent USA. It's terribly important. Now, the question of whether Reagan is a decent man or not, you can shoot a man who's not decent because you want someone who's worse, goes back to a program I did a while ago on Ronald Reagan's coming to power and how he came to power, and I promise to do more. There's a few missing pieces in the Ronald Reagan story and in the people around him. One of the men that helped his career, that discovered him, died last week, April the 29th, 1981. William Meiklejohn, Meiklejohn. Meiklejohn was a talent scout. He searched such people such as Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney, and he discovered Ronald Reagan. He died last week, as I say, and he went around the country. He began his career before he knew Reagan. In 1930, he joined the Music Corporation of America. Now, in 1919, Germany started rearming, and by 1920, the United States multinationals, Henry Ford and U.S. Steel and the Mellons and the DuPonts, were arming Hitler for the war against the Soviet Union. As soon as the revolution was over and Herbert Hoover came home from Europe after dispensing money to these armies to get ready for World War II, the Germans, in their mind, were going to get ready for World War II. And certainly by the 1930s, we were well into funding and thinking in terms of World War II to make war against Russia, and arming what was the Nazi Party and Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany. By 1936, Franco was given support during a brutal war by Mussolini and Hitler and took over Spain. Well, Meiklejohn worked in Hollywood. He worked for Music Corporation of America. So to unlock certain pictures of Ronald Reagan, we have to go back and do more work into what Music Corporation was in 1930. We know at the time of Watergate, John Mitchell and Martha Mitchell and all the Republicans were at a party given by Music Corporation of America, and they've been very far right organization for many years. But how political they were in 1930s when Meiklejohn worked for them, I don't know. He went into 1940, he started working for Paramount Picture. But it's interesting, among the people he discovered, one was Lucille Ball, who became a very conservative Republican through her career, and the other was Alan Ladd, who became a director of 20th Century Fox, which is a intertangling can of worms with the purchase of Fox Studio by Marvin Gaye from Denver, Colorado, that I go into in bits and pieces. But Alan Ladd was one of the people he discovered, and he got a introduction. Ronald Reagan was a radio announcer in Des Moines, Iowa, in 1937. That was right after was in the period of the Spanish Civil War, actually, in the period where several years before Hitler was to invade Poland, 2 years before. And Ronald Reagan was in Des Moines, Iowa, and a woman named Joy Hodges contacted Bill Meiklejohn to meet Ronald Reagan and give him a screen test. They compared him to another Robert Taylor, and he was flown out to Warner Brothers and got $200 a week contract at Warner Brothers. That began the career of Ronald Reagan. It's an interesting career from the radio announcer to Hollywood, and after he was at Warner Brothers Studio in 1940, 1942, he made movies with Errol Flynn, who, according to Charles Hyam, was deep into the Gestapo, working with German counterintelligence with many stars in Hollywood. And you have to read Errol Flynn, The Untold Story of Charles Hyam, and the years of Flynn's work with the Gestapo and the Nazis, and make an overlay of the work that he did on 2 movies with Ronald Reagan. They were very much part of the social set together in Hollywood. So if we're working with a nice man, it's a good question. Can a president who's basically a decent man pursue policies that are not? But if we're working with a man who was on the fringe of the radical fascists and then working with the outright fascists from the Hoover Institute and in California through his entire career as he escalated into the political picture, then we're obviously working with somebody whose best interests are against the people of the United States. Our foreign policy, I think, has been misdirected, and the funds and intent gone the wrong way, as these columnists are now finding out and realizing. But the important thing is, how far ahead were people like Adolf Hitler or Ronald Reagan or Richard Nixon selected for the role and groomed by corporations like General Electric or Music Corporation of America, or they picked years before and put into strategic places as their careers escalated. In a few minutes, I'll go into bits and pieces of Alexander Haig's career, and a recent author about Haig said that he wasn't just a half-assed, haphazard kind of an escalation where he's in the right time and right place. He's been manipulative ever since he was at West Point and jumped over these people, hand-plucked right to Douglas MacArthur's side over in Asia at the time that important decisions and treaties were being signed. He went right out of his classmates group into the very important top people. He just made that giant leap, and he's stayed there ever since. Before I get to Haig again, and this does all tie into the Hinckley picture and foreign policy that I'm going into in Guatemala and other places, and the Vanderbilt energy and the general kind of power, the manipulations behind the scene of people that are strategically placed and move up, such as Russell Little at the time of the SLA, and the Nazis and the Republicans, and William Colby, who formed the SLA, working with counterintelligence and Nazis, and then young people appearing as lone independents, just taking, in quotes, a political stand and having shootouts, whether they're in California or Washington. It's the same kind of organization that is between them, so they're not far apart. But that John Hinckley shooting at the Old Corral at the Hilton Hotel is just too silent for May Brussell. If not for you, I don't like it. We're told that there was that one madman who shot 4 people and hurt them terribly in Washington, D.C. on March the 30th of this year. And there's still a question of whether there were 2 or more people shooting. 4 people were gunned down like hunting victims, and the president was dragged in by the armpits into that hospital, bleeding out of the nose and mouth. We don't hear a word about John Hinckley. He hasn't been charged for shooting the press secretary, and that poor Mr. James Brady is critically ill, facing maybe another surgery. Half the brain was gone, and he seems to be struggling and is in terrible pain. That Tim McCarthy, who was in serious condition and released, hit in the abdomen, is out. We haven't heard about Thomas Delahanty, who got the bullet in the neck and had that closed surgery for fear that it would explode inside his body. You saw television, you saw them gunned down. They replayed it over and over. And this is interesting for students of the assassinations and the attempted murder of President of the United States. And we don't know how he will go through this one yet. It's interesting because maybe you weren't around at Dallas 17 years ago and you don't remember, or in 68 when Robert Kennedy was shot, or in 1968 when Martin Luther King was killed, or even when Patty Hearst was kidnapped with the SLA, or the Manson family story that came out. There have been so many hoaxes and confusions, and now you can see for yourself the silencing that goes on when this person is a known member of the Nazi Party, kicked out for being too violent, taken to an American military base, and then to a known mind control center, and we don't hear a word. Now, it's been weeks since the president was shot. This is May the 3rd. He was shot 30th of March. He was visiting with Prince Charles this week, and according to Associated Press story, and you can see it in the movies, Ronald Reagan is limping. And until the shootout, we didn't see a limp or any sign of a limp. And this week, Reagan told Prince Charles that his slight limp recently is from an old break in his thigh. It had nothing to do with falling off of horses. But in the physical examination, the story of this perfect specimen, this perfect 70-year-old specimen, before the shootout at the Old Corral, we didn't see him limping, and now he's having trouble with his thigh. Another important article by Maxine Cheshire, she has one every week in the Washington Post. If you get to read her column, it's very significant. And she was talking about the controversy of whether Ronald Reagan could take a little vacation because it gets hot in Washington in the summer. He wants to come out to Santa Barbara, his home, or whether he should hang around Camp David and stay in Washington, D.C. And she wrote this week, those who have been winning the argument to keep him convalescing at the White House and at Camp David feel it would be difficult, if not impossible, to keep him off a horse. Also, some argue that proximity to Washington is important if the public is going to perceive that Reagan is still running things. It's important to perceive that Reagan is still running things. It reminds me of the play The Balcony by John Genet. I don't know how many of you saw it or read it, about 3 men in a horror house, and they wear costumes for their acts and get into it, and one's a priest, and one's a judge, and one's a general, and then their female companions dress appropriately to the way they are dressed, and the town is bombed, and they have to reassure the people in the town that the cardinal is there, and that the judge is there, and that the general is on hand. So the men who are at the horror house at the time, the plumber and different people have to go out in the street in a parade in the costumes that they're using for their sexual fantasies, and they wave and act appropriately, and then the natives are satisfied. So, as Maxine Cheshire says, it's important to perceive that he's still running things. So you might ask, who's running things? If we have to perceive it, then who's running it? Well, there was an article one of my listeners to the tape sent to me this month, March 1981, in the Washington Monthly. I don't know how many of you get that newsletter out of Washington, D.C., and it's an article about Alexander Haig, who I believe is absolutely the man to watch for the one who wants to run things. His getting up anxiously after the assassination attempt and saying the Constitution tells him he was in charge was just kind of a slip, because he really knows he wants to be in charge. And the article on Haig came out, as I say, in March, so it had to be printed or ready to go to print a month before, at least a month, in a small newsletter like this, before the shootout at the Hilton. And it's about the personality of Alexander Haig, and it warns about his wanting to be ambitious and work his way up. And in conclusion, the article says that he lost the vice president, running for the presidency. He wanted to be the president. He didn't even make it the primaries. But watch Alexander Haig, because not only a Secretary of Defense, but he has slots that he wants to fill. That's, in effect, what it's saying, that he wants to move up. And it goes into the biography of Forget Those Stories about loyal Al Haig. This is from the article in Washington Monthly. It's misleading. He looks the part of a military man that's assigned to him. He looks like he would take orders and be commander-in-chief. But this author says, try listening to him instead of looking. Listen to the way he uses his words in public. Look at his career and review his career and see if you see a different, stranger truth that doesn't emerge. It's a curious thing that goes beyond authority. People at West Point obey orders or take authority, but Haig is not of that ilk. And it goes on to say that they were trained in West Point with the old honor, obey, and duty, the military values of honor, obey, and duty to your country. And he warns that Haig is of the post-war managerial ethic. That is the Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, that formed our CIA. He formed the mentality for men like Haig, who go from the Defense Department, Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, CIA. It's not your duty and your country. It's how you roll yourself from one place to the other in order to be in those strategic locations. And this article tells about his Philadelphia birthplace. His father was an attorney who died when Haig was young. And remember, if you want them, you can order a back tape I've done on the Philadelphia connections to the past assassinations and conspiracies. He went to West Point, and then he went to Japan. Right after West Point, the vicar of Americans' foreign policy, and he questions this too, the right to say he's the vicar of that, went right to Japan, where he was under Douglas MacArthur. He graduated 214th out of a class of 310. So he was 68th or so from the bottom of his class at West Point, but graduated in 1947, the year that the CIA was formed, the National Security Council, and the CIA, and was flown immediately to Douglas MacArthur. And the author said you would expect that he'd be on the personnel staff and have some job placement knack and so forth. But Haig went with a man named Jonathan Ladd, L-A-D-D, Jonathan Ladd, who later became the commander of the Green Berets. Those were the counterintelligence spies that William Colby headed and had in all of Southeast Asia, and then brought home, as I said, to our West Coast to get their tentacles into the law enforcement in California. But they're all over the world. Jonathan Ladd went with Haig, and they went out with MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, immediately after his graduation in 1947. And then when Chiang Kai-shek evacuated the mainland of China, Haig and Ladd went immediately to Taiwan, to Chiang Kai-shek, and one of the main officers on the compound post at Taiwan for Chiang Kai-shek's arrival and assimilation into that location was a General Alonzo Fox. And by 1950, Haig had married his daughter, Patricia. So by 1947, when the National Security Council was formed, Haig was out of West Point and on his way with Douglas MacArthur. And in 1950, he had married the woman whose father was at Taiwan in charge of assimilating Chiang Kai-shek into that modus operandi. There's a book called Self-Destruction, written by a man with a pseudonym. He uses the name Cincinnatus. He's an Army officer who writes in the book Self-Destruction that in the wake of the war, after 1945, when World War II was over, and he was in the Army, duty, honor, and country were replaced by something different, a need to be in the right place at the right time. That means that your duty and your honor and your country don't matter. You had strategic agents formed. We had the OSS that informed us of spies or danger from overseas that didn't do too well during, certainly at Pearl Harbor, which we knew about in advance. But we formed the CIA starting in 45 and had the National Security Council, National Security Agency in 47 when he got out of West Point, and he leaps to Douglas MacArthur in Southeast Asia. He's over in Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek. And careerism, rather than dedication to one's men, was the way to get ahead. Now that is the point when I began with the program, the Coalition for a Decent CIA, for a Decent USA, not CIA, asking the question, does Alexander Haig or do these people in control really want a decent USA? Is duty, honor, and country something that is passé, that they use their experiences to further the power of this fascism which they are ushering in? Haig was instrumental in landing at Incheon in South Korea on Douglas MacArthur's forces. And just recently, again, Maxine Cheshire has an article that the movie on Incheon, it's a $46 million glorifying this Korean adventure, is funded by Reverend Moon and a producer in Japan, a member of the Unification Church with unlimited money, millions of dollars. And they used our Marine Corps, our Pentagon, our Army, United States Army, to help make this movie of the landing over in South Korea. And Reverend Moon and his gang have put up this money. Now, I got information a long time ago that the money for Reverend Moon came from Nazi money that was taken out of Germany when, at the end of the war, 1945, when Hitler collapsed, to make a resurgence for World War III using these funds. And Alexander Haig was in Southeast Asia with MacArthur. He was in South Korea. He's working with Reverend Moon and that gang from the Pentagon in making and glorifying this, and worked with Chiang Kai-shek, which means that the narcotics that funded through Chiang Kai-shek's operation in China and then continued from Taiwan could go into the resurgence and people of the ilk of Reverend Moon who come out making movies like this for $46 million. Remember, he's the man who put up all that money for ads at the time that Nixon was going to be indicted for Watergate and was under suspicion. Incidentally, Alexander Haig works, or had worked, or still does, for United Technology. And there's an account of United Technology in Wall Street Journal just last week, 2 weeks ago, in case you didn't see it, April 15th, from Hartford, Connecticut. It said, when Alexander Haig left the presidency of United Technology to become Secretary of State, he made a financial sacrifice. He makes 10% of the salary that he would at United Technology. He was pulling in a salary of $1.3 million. This is the salary at United Technology, and he's working for just a much less in the Pentagon at this time. But United Technology's profits through the decisions of war, we have to make war against Russia, we have to arm this country, we have to arm that. There, according to the Wall Street Journal, the United Technology's profits went up 15% in this last quarter, from 3.3 to 3.33 billion. It used to be 2.89 billion, but in their quarter, just the last quarter, it went to 3.33 billion. And United Technologies is going to make the engines and the motors for the space colonies, and these have been also linked to NASA and Nazis, and I refer to the book Alternative 3 and other indications that a lot of treachery can come out of the building of the space colonies without supervision or people knowing what's going on. Alexander Haig once made a remark when they asked him was he going to resign under some recent scandal. He says, I didn't come here just to shuffle papers. This is the kind of remark he makes. But this company, through his help of getting people so war-minded that we have to give contracts to everything that comes along because Russia is taking over the world. And yet the corporation that he was president of in the last quarter made $3.33 billion. And that goes back, I've spent a lot of time on Haig because he's the successor to the John Hinckley story and the shooting. If Reagan doesn't survive or gets sick, Haig has the ambition to be the president. If Bush is president, Haig would be handpicked as vice president. They would bypass other people, just as Jerry Ford was handplucked by Richard Nixon. In order for this to not happen, people have to be very alert and to watch Haig and his moves, and a lot of columnists are doing that. One article that was interesting this week on the John Hinckley case, and I will get into more of them next week and leave the international affairs aside, but the international policies are decided by people such as Alexander Haig, and as I say, Walter Stessel, the cabinet that is under Richard Nixon. And when a man is shot or knocked out of the running or immobilized or scared, such as Richard Nixon, then Haig can push these policies. I call him Nixon. Oh, forgive me. I can't tell the difference in my filing hardly between Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. The same people put them into power, the same organizations, the same cliques, the same sleaziness, the people behind the deal with the rhetoric of the war and the terrorism. There's so little difference. But the point is that whether Richard Nixon is moved out of office and Alexander Haig becomes chief of staff in the White House and is bumping out people like Haldeman and not letting them reach the president and controlling the telephone. And remember, he was acting president at one time, at the time of Watergate, and showed how great he was and wants to be back there. When these people make such tremendous profits, and when the people, the masses of the people, are paying the taxes or too poor to pay the taxes, have nothing or are scared of having anything and losing it, when these people move up and decide foreign policy and domestic policy and conceal the assassins of the men who precede them, then assassination is a good tool for them to assure their power and their profits. In this case, Haig has both. He works for a company that is Warfare Company, president of the company, and makes decisions. It was the same way with Henry Kissinger. He was under the pay of David Nelson Rockefeller when he made decisions to overthrow Chile or to have military juntas in other countries and cut off aid to countries that seemed democratic or leftist and support the military dictatorships because the profits are greater for the oil companies if they don't have to pay the native populations. A man shouldn't be Secretary of State such as Henry Kissinger and be on the board of directors of Chase Manhattan working for David Rockefeller and have his wife under the pay of Rockefeller, and Haig working for president of this United Technology and making decisions of foreign policy. And as I mentioned before, and I want to do in the near future as soon as possible, go more into Fritz Cramer, the man from Nazi Germany who discovered Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger. And the point is that when people from Nazi Germany are selecting our secretaries of state and selecting our foreign policies in the Pentagon, then you and I, the native population, can expect the same treatment they got in Germany, where Hitler can take control of the banks. You can get rampant inflation. The rich stayed rich. They were never poor, and they had their art treasures, and they had their trips and their pleasure palaces. And they knew the banking procedures if they lost the war to retrench. They had the guarantee of the Allies we wouldn't bomb their very important factories and the ITT factories that were making airplanes for Germany at the time. They were in the United States making wire and telephone poles for the United States. They controlled their profits while the small banks, the small businesses go under and the people get strangled. And it's very important to see the kind of president you have, the kind of cabinets they have, because what they did in the past is what you can expect for yourself. And the people that put them in, if you look at their lifestyles and read what they say and how they say it and how they acted, there's no reason to think you can't expect the same for yourself. Now, in addition, I have 1 minute to go. The silence on the Hinckley case is not only outrageous, but there's an article in the Washington Post this last week that the U.S. Attorney Charles Ruff, who would be prosecuting Reagan's alleged would-be assassin, is being pushed away, and they're trying to bring in some other attorneys for the prosecution so that he won't be on the job. And the people deciding on legal counsel to take this federal position as U.S. Attorney are being selected by Howard Baker of Tennessee and Strom Thurmond and Paul Laxalt and Governor Mathias of Maryland and Barry Goldwater in Arizona. Now, if Mr. Brady dies, it'll be hard to see how Hinckley can get off that case. But with this kind of removing the judge from the case and getting a hand-picked judge for John Hinckley, plus Edward Bennett Williams of the CIA being his attorney, there is a lot of behind-the-scenes finagling that we'll go into next week. I just did want to update some of the international implications of men like Haig that move up through the bullet and can't get their voted in, tied up to strong fascist organizations all of their lives, and now are on the peak of controlling us through their offices in the White House. But we'll go back to Hinckley next week and pick up some of the details of that case. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week.
That was the great Mae Brussell. I'm S.T. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show. And from the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
Midnight Rider News and the Midnight Rider News Show are copyright 2019 by S.T. Patrick. All rights reserved. You can email the show at midnightridernews@gmail.com. You can follow us on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. All of our archives are free and can be found at midnightridernews.com. Deep Truth Journal can be followed on Facebook at Deep Truth Journal and on Twitter at DTJ Magazine.